All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here in front of you today. It is a privilege for me to be here, and definitely understanding the depth of experience and insight that's present here. I look forward to a robust conversation. So what I'd like to do, especially coming off the heels of a really good conversation around the innovative work that's going on in DC, I'd like to frame for you what we're doing within Detroit Future City, both what it was as a planning effort, what it began to lay out for Detroit, but then also what we're doing today as an implementation office to really move the planning work forward to begin to transform the city. And ultimately, I think I'm going to be able to frame some key points that my colleagues will be able to pick up on as they go through their presentations. So before I step into it, and what you're looking at on the screen right now is a shot of the storefront of our office on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, an open office. So anyone in the city, literally anyone, can walk in and talk to us about what we're doing and what they would like to do. I want to note a couple things off the bat, though, is our initiative, the planning of it, and today and the implementation of it is funded through philanthropy exclusively. The Kresge Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, the Erb Family Foundation, and the Knight Foundation, to name a few. It's an initiative that started in 2010 under the previous mayor, Dave Bing, in the city, and was a three and a half year planning process led by Tony Griffin and Dan Patera, Tony of planning fame here in DC, developing major plan for the Anacostia Waterway. And I was part of the planning team, and I led a major part of the design work for Tony. In the beginning of 2013, we launched the strategic framework itself. This is this large tome that we developed, a 350-page guide for Detroit's transformation. And shortly thereafter, I was asked to help to start up a new implementation office for this. So this is very different than what you see in normal municipal planning enterprises, right? Something that's done within the city and then is moved forward by the city administration. At the time, I think many would argue that we had a public sector that wasn't entirely prepared to move this forward. We wanted to make it happen, and I know many of the foundations that supported the work wanted to make it happen. And so since then, we've developed, myself and my leadership partner at the time, Heidi Alcock, had developed an implementation office, moved a number of initiatives forward, built a staff, built a budget, got an agenda together of what we're going to accomplish. We brought in an executive director in Ken Cockrell Jr., former council president, and former mayor of Detroit. And we're moving forward in some pretty important ways that I think Dr. Jackson has framed for us already, and I want to start to walk through those. It's important to say also that with Detroit emerging from bankruptcy literally late last week and into the weekend, this is a critical moment in the city's history, right? And in many ways, Detroit Future City presupposed the bankruptcy. In fact, when we did our initial analyses, it was quite evident. This is early 2010. We knew right where we were going. And this is why there was a bold move for a transformative plan that was put forward. You know, what we've begun to uncover, though, are the ways in which Detroit, what is typically defined by these overwhelming liabilities, these overwhelming challenges, that those very liabilities in some ways can be converted into huge assets and can allow Detroit to do what other cities cannot and to become a global leader for other cities to follow. So I think that's the remarkable thing that I hope you can take away from some of the work that we're doing right now. And so let's get into it. So first off, this is a shot of one part of Detroit's skyline. It's a shot that you don't typically see, right? Certainly not in Time magazine, not in the New York Times, not in any real national or international media, yet there it is. You know, it's a site of some really remarkable growth right now, remarkable reinvestment. Hundreds of millions of dollars reinvested, large-scale buildings brought back online, tens of thousands of jobs emerging, virtually every month, by the way. And you see here a pipeline of 3,500 new multifamily dwellings set up for the next 18 months. And new opportunities emerging for many here. But at the same time, it's one part of Detroit, right? It's one part, and in some ways it may be a privileged part that speaks to only a certain type of audience. And this, of course, is the other Detroit, right? This is Detroit that we know well. And I'm just noticing also that the screen is So there's a lot of grass in the lower part of the shot here, and that's the thing I really want you to take away from this. Basically, Detroit is defined in many ways by its overarching vacancy. Areas that have, negatively impact quality of life. They begin to reduce opportunities for residents, and they begin to define an existence that is incredibly challenging for many generation upon generation sites of massive disinvestment and depopulation over time. Yet we think that here is another opportunity to move the city forward, and to move it forward in a highly equitable way that provides opportunity for all Detroiters. And we're going to talk about that this morning. So yeah, you know what? I think can we go to full screen on this? It's in a view that's just yeah. See that's all the grass. All right. And then the whole presentation won't be me scrolling through this one photo, as breathtaking as it is. Thank you. So anyway, you get the shot here. So by the way, there are 20 square miles of the city that look like this. If you begin to consider the blight that exists on the streets today, blighted structures, and the rights-of-way and streets that are adjacent to those, you're closing in on probably 40 square miles. Some would argue 50 square miles. And if you think about this also, and we're going to talk about this in a second, you look at the total land area of the District of Columbia, which is right around, say, 65 square miles. You're looking at 3/4 of the district as vacant like this in Detroit. In the district, by the way, you have about, let's say, 650,000 folks. That's just shy of Detroit's population today. And if you look at the overall land area of the district, it's roughly half the size of Detroit. So in half the size of Detroit, you have all of Detroit's population present. That begins to make you think about something, right? About how you can begin to concentrate investment, make sure populations are centered in walkable areas for people to get around, to have opportunity for themselves. That's kind of what we're getting at here, and that is an important point to frame here this morning. So that said, here's some other key points to keep in mind. And you're going to see, I'm not going to bring these up again, but you're going to see them weave through the rest of the presentation here about what we're doing in Detroit. So in Detroit, you have a city in many cases, for most of the population, doesn't satisfy the health and retail needs of its population. So you have $1.5 billion worth of leakage, spending leakage, going out of the city every single year. 200 million of that's for groceries alone. You have a city with 3 times the rate of childhood asthma when compared to the national average. You have 50% greater number of deaths to heart disease every year than the national average, and a whole slew of others that I won't get into. But you know that there's tremendous challenges here. High obesity rates, all the things that you might think you'd see, they are here. And my colleagues, I'm sure, will talk more about this. But we know that while Detroit, with all of its vacant land, ranks lowest as one of the largest American cities with available park space per resident, that we can begin to do things differently here. We can begin to turn things around, and Detroit Future City is really, that's what this is about. That's why it was established. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here, how the planning process emerged, and what it led us to. Overall, we've created this 50-year vision for the city, and it's composed of these major pieces that you see on the screen right here. None of them on their own are they're not really that remarkable or innovative. They're fairly straightforward. It's really the combination of them that's so critical, connecting land use strategies about where people live, connecting them to where they work, beginning to create much more sustainable methods for urban revitalization. As we developed the work, there was a massive effort around civic engagement and building civic capacity. This is not a top-down process. This was an effort that was fostered through, as you see here, 163,000 interactions with residents. This is a plan that's been authored by the residents of Detroit, including myself as one of them. And I think because of that, it's given us not only all of us as residents a greater sense of authorship in the work, but it's allowed us to be much more informed and present in the implementation of it. And that is critical when you're trying to move something like this forward in a city with the challenges that Detroit faces. The planning itself composed 5 main pieces. You see them on the screen here. Each of them undergirded by this robust engagement process, informing it throughout, allowing us to kind of test ideas along the way. There was a kind of feedback loop that would move through the process. And it allowed us to emerge with some key recommendations and findings. And I'm going to move through these fairly quickly, but the key idea here is that what we wanted to put forward, we wanted to make sure it was fundamentally evidence-based. This is a view of Detroit and understanding what we can do for its future that's not been seen in a very long time. We've had many kind of impassioned vision plans over the last 2 decades, some of which I've even worked on. But none of them really kind of landed on the ground firmly in a basis of understanding what markets were saying, what demographics were telling us, right? What educational trends were telling us, what mobility patterns were telling us. And that's what this work began to do. A lot of deep dive diagnostics tied to a wealth of information and community input. From there, we understood that, of course, the current land use of the city of Detroit, which is dominated by the single-family home, which is the abundance of yellow that you see on the screen in front of you, this one-dimensional land use is crippling the city. In many ways, the city at nearly 2 million people at its peak population in 1955 was already not sustainable, right? And today, we're just at a much more kind of exacerbated version of that. As we move forward, we want to create a more balanced city, one that actually recognizes all of the vacancy that's beneath all of that yellow, by the way, and begins to reconsider its future. And that's what you see in this new land use strategy here with clear kind of blocks of color on here, clear definition in what's actually happening. You see the yellow bar is shrunk dramatically, right? We're reconsidering the position of the single-family home in Detroit. We're understanding that there's opportunities for green residential living here in areas where we have moderate degrees of vacancy, where we know reinvestment for new housing starts just isn't smart right now. You're going to flood the market in a way that won't be sustainable. But on top of it, we can begin to create more concentrated nodes of development that can support walkable urbanism, begin to support healthy lifestyles that we know we need, and focus on connecting people from dense, sustainable neighborhoods into opportunities for employment in a range of employment districts across the city that go well beyond the greater downtown and midtown, which typically defines the totality of employment in the city. And so you begin to see this range here split up, right? Where people live and work above commercial and residential, potential for open space then in the middle, right? Beginning to redefine what these areas are, where today the zoning may tell us R1 and B2 for residential and business. There's not a lot of R going on, there's not a lot of B going on. There's an incredible amount of suffering, typically gone through by people who are older, people of color, people with poor mobility, and poor access to health amenities and services. That's the reality of these places, right? These places right here are roughly 3/4 the size of the District of Columbia. We have to do better, and we have to realize that those areas offer Detroit a future that can allow others to follow and learn. So this is where we're headed. We've developed a number of land use typologies that begin to fulfill these new land use dimensions over time. I'll move through those quickly. Here are the employment districts. I can tell you that typically in the past, the conversation I said around employment in Detroit would begin and end right about here. And that's fantastic if you happen to be a physician or a leader of a creative enterprise or a lawyer or a financier. But if you're anyone else, there's a lot of other places that provide employment across the city. We've just not recognized them. You know, important global logistics hubs in our Southwest that were made by the auto industry over nearly a century, right? Large-scale manufacturing in the Northeast, an educational and medical anchor institution hub in our Northwest that rivals that in our Midtown area that we just kind of forgot about, right? So how do we begin to actually rally investment around these areas to drive greater opportunity for the city overall? And how do we do that in a way that actually enables much more strategic renewal of our existing systems, right? We don't have the luxury of generating a capital expenditure and operating expenditure program 10 years and walk it out over time, right? Because in 10 years, everything's going to be different on the ground. You've got to understand how you can begin to make subtle moves along the way. That's what this plan begins to speak to, understanding areas where we need to double and triple down in investment in fixed infrastructure to support the economic growth we need to provide more Detroiters employment opportunities, particularly in a city in which for every 4 residents, we have 1 private sector job, in which 50.3% of our population is not part of the active labor force. No matter what else we're doing, if we can't get more folks employed, we can't support them with the infrastructure systems, we're not going to be able to turn it around. At the same time, in the lighter tones there, you begin to see areas where we can really rethink how we provide city systems, right? This isn't about removing systems. This is about delivering them in very different ways. This is about taking what was a fixed, large-scale unibody bus that drove down a street 5 times a day for a woman who might need a doctor twice a month, to an on-call paratransit system that provides her a much higher degree of service at an incredibly lower cost to the public transit provider. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about, and those are the kinds of things that we're trying to implement right now. I'll give you an example here that'll lead into the rest of the presentation. So here you can see the existing, this is exactly what Dr. Jackson was speaking to. This is the fixed gray infrastructure system for stormwater capture in the city of Detroit. Much like the district and many other cities in the US and in parts of Europe, we have a combined sewer overflow system, which means every time it rains outside, what goes in the catch basin combines with the sanitary waste from this building and so on. Now in the situation of Detroit, when we get a little over ½ an inch of rain, it typically overwhelms our CSO facilities, which you see dotted along the riverfront here. And when we do that, we have to do a direct discharge to the river, of course, taking raw human waste out into the river. As Dr. Jackson alluded to, Detroit sits on 22% of the world's freshwater supply, 84% of the US freshwater supply. We have to do better, right? We can't do this. Lake Erie this summer had a huge phosphorus bloom, not unrelated to these kinds of issues, off the street as well. So this is a critical issue, and where in 2011 we had 36 direct discharges to the river. By the way, for the EPA folks in the room, that's about 31 above our limit of 5. We think we can get that down to around 5 discharges if we actually use our available land area. That land that sits there fallow, contributing to blight, can actually help us create a new dynamic system, one that we've just not considered in the past. And it's these kinds of investments and these kinds of actions that I think really get us excited, and where we know we have an opportunity to become a kind of trailblazer here. You can see some of the ways in which these areas would be aggregated across the city. That all rolls up into a new open space network. So it isn't like, okay, all the attention is going to be paid in these areas where we're going to concentrate conventional development, right? And everything else, we're just going to forget about the rest of these spaces. In fact, there's a high degree of investment, a high degree of thoughtful, innovative idea generation in these areas to create an open space network that actually defines a new future here, right? Where we can provide food. Detroit might be the first food secure city globally by 2050. The ability to actually produce energy, biomass and switchgrass, anaerobic digestion, and photovoltaic power production, right? Imagine, there was a comment earlier for DC about all the photovoltaic arrays that could go across your roofs, right? Imagine the costs that go with that about planting those on roofs. What if you could do them in a holding strategy across open available land and run green infrastructure systems through them to capture stormwater? Then you've got something, then you can actually begin to provide major power back to the grid, and we're beginning to look at these things now. So that gets us to our implementation process. I'll move through this fairly quickly here, but ideally what we do, what we've done through the planning and what we do today is bound in partnerships, right? We do this with everybody with us at the table. We leverage the strength of community participants, political leaders, state, federal, local, otherwise, to have a larger impact than we might on our own. It leads us to highly catalytic action, the idea that we're starting something here. We're not going to end the sentence, but we're surely going to get it going. We make sure that we're strategically coordinating and informing decisions along the way in a way that we've just not done in the past, and really many other major cities don't have to do. We don't have an option to mess up here. So it gets us to our implementation priorities and what we're doing. The open space network, which I've shown you. So there's a couple ways, there's several ways in which we're actually doing this. I'll show you a couple here. One is an overall carbon buffering pilot program. We had a conversation earlier about PM 2.5. That's exactly what this is getting at, where we are taking adjacent public land along major freeways, many of them which were kind of hatcheted through our existing urban fabric in the mid-1950s. And actually beginning to plant trees along here to block a lot of the particulate matter that comes off, beginning to improve air quality overall. There's a whole host of other things that come off of this, but it's critical. We just had one of our first big deployments of this with the Greening Detroit in southwest Detroit along the Southfield Freeway. Another focus is on dendroremediation, essentially using trees to remediate existing toxicity in soils. Detroit has a lot of available land that is toxic, Big surprise, right? But we don't have the need for reinvestment and reutilization of that land in conventional ways for a long time. Therefore, we can use slower, more cost-effective, and more natural methods for that remediation that also creates more of a land holding pattern here that helps us correct supply and demand problems in our market. And we're moving on our first 2 pilots for this coming out of this fall. It also gets us to important tools like a vacant land transformation guide. This is something we're developing right now and we'll launch in late March next year. That provides a kind of menu of options for residents to follow in understanding how they can begin to reutilize available land, improve it in their neighborhood, and stabilize their neighborhood overall, and provide very detailed specifications to contractors to understand what they can do to maximize infiltration of stormwater, et cetera. And in fact, in the upper left there, you see an intervention by one of our partners in Detroit. This is actually a land art effort in some of the vacant land that actually contributes to stormwater management. It gets us to the systems renewal overall. Again, for the EPA folks in the room, this is a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative project, the Shoreline Cities grant. Detroit Future City, along with the Southeastern Michigan Council of Governments, got together and worked to develop a strategy for this and actually won the grant from the EPA to deploy a small sum of money, $1 million, in Detroit to bring the system online. We matched it with $1 million from philanthropic sources to render $2 million to cover some sizable areas in our Lower East Side and deploy these systems. And many of you know in cities that's a very small amount of money to deploy for major infrastructure systems, and it's a great illustration of what you can do in big ways to change things. Part of this also is about restoring a lot of the tree canopy. There's been conversation about this morning. The restoration of the canopy is key. We have to make sure that we can begin to bring that back. Today, by some estimates, Detroit has half the tree canopy it should have. If we can bring back the other half through concepts like this and the open space network, we can begin to save lives. Most of our seniors live in areas that that have low canopy coverage, and as a effect, we have a lot of loss of life each summer with rapid gain in temperatures. We're also working with the U.S. Department of Energy on photovoltaic power deployment in the city, looking at 3 sites. We think between 30 to 35 acres of land, we can produce 5 megawatts each here and incorporate green infrastructure systems that can also go to pool water for irrigation for adjacent biomass and food crops. We've also worked to develop Detroit's Resilient Cities submission for the Rockefeller Foundation. We developed this last year and worked with the City of Detroit to submit it again this year. Many of you are familiar with this effort. This kind of bundles all these resilience efforts together into one banner, and we've submitted this, and we hope to hear more shortly. We're also working with the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy to better equip Detroiters with available technology to understand what they can do on the ground to not only catch a bus, but understand what options are available to them for employment, et cetera. This is a major enterprise for us because Detroit has not had the ability to invest in its technological infrastructure over time, and it allows us actually to do a great deal of leapfrogging today, where many cities dutifully paid billions and billions of dollars for their Cray mainframes in the 1980s. We did none of it. And we have the ability to actually leverage cloud-based services and things like this to jump ahead. These are the things we're trying to do, and we're trying to get there quickly. At the core of it, of course, is providing improvements to quality of life. One illustration of this is in a community in the north kind of central part of the city along 7 Mile Road between John R. and Woodward. It's an area that's actually defined by immigrant populations, typically Chaldeans. These are Christian Arabs, and also Syrian refugees. This area has suffered mightily over the last few years, so it's been rapidly disinvested. It's an area, though, that had a really strong commercial corridor, and we're working to bring that back and to develop an example of a strong residential commercial corridor outside of the downtown. We're in the middle of this process. We started a while back. It's actually starting up again, and it speaks to a lot of these kind of these walkable urbanism pieces that we've been working on for quite a while. Another example of this for us is a focus on deconstruction. We're bringing down blight in the city, but doing it in a way that's much more thoughtful than straight demolition that contributes to great landfills and really underutilizes the opportunity for employment. In this case, What we've done is developed a study in the southwest part of Detroit on 10 homes using 5 different deconstruction techniques, determining what types of materials we can pull out of those homes, what the retail value can be, because when you compare demo to deconstruction, of course, on a cost basis, they don't balance out. Demo is always going to be cheaper, but if you add the revenue stream on the resale in there, then the equation changes, opportunities for employment and change. And what we also studied in here were all of the contaminant output, understanding lead and asbestos and other things that came off the site, and understanding the best techniques to begin to mitigate that, which is incredibly important because Detroit, after going through a large-scale effort through the Blight Removal Task Force, many folks have probably heard of this, has identified nearly 40,000, probably upwards of 60,000 structures that need to come down over the next really 12 months. As they come down, there's an opportunity to really to improve circumstances on the ground, but to potentially contaminate every child in Detroit. We already have an epidemic of lead poisoning in the city, which you guys know very well. We don't want to mushroom this into something colossal that's going to take the city back another 50 years. So what we're working on are some dust management pilots and new techniques to actually manage this, which in many cases come down to actually using a water hose. This is not high tech, but it's important that these things get worked into contracts with contractors that do this work. Lastly, making sure that we can employ more Detroiters is key. One small way, I'm not going to show you most of our portfolio here, but one small way we're doing this is by using the materials that come out of these deconstruction efforts and actually developing retail centers that Detroiters can actually run and operate themselves. This is something that we're trying to start up right now with the Detroit Building Authority. We're also part of a recruiting effort to draw in the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses program. We were the 17th city out of 19, so we weren't quite as high up there as we would have hoped. But anyway, they landed, and they're there, and they're providing opportunities to stimulate greater entrepreneurial activity. Detroit, believe it or not, ranks as second in the United States for major U.S. cities with entrepreneurial activity. The only problem is that exists in sole proprietors that can't get to scale. They work out of their basements, right? And they do things at a small level that doesn't have an impact. How do we get it to scale? How do we get them to rent space, buy equipment, et cetera? That's what this is about, and they're in their 3rd cohort now. All of it also ties back to strengthening civic capacity overall, making sure our community in general is better equipped to move ourselves forward in the future. Part of that goes through our school-based program with curriculum development in certain high schools, which is an example here. And at the end of the day, with all of this kind of broader policy, the kind of bigger gestures for strategy and things like that, it comes down to this, right? And this is part of, some folks here are part of our team participating in the deployment of one of our carbon forests along a freeway in a neighborhood in the southwest side. It takes all of these pieces together to have an impact in a place like Detroit, and that's what we do. So thank you.
Now, Dan, I have physician and even some public health colleagues that would say, well, this is just economic development, it's social development, it's not really health. We do environmental health, and environmental health is about toxic substances. So I'm looking to you, Loretta, to help us figure out how, and the Surgeon General, how this connects to health, please. By the way, terrific presentation. Thank you, Dan.